Welcome to the Daily DLP. Today, we're going to go over a bit of football terminology that you're likely to hear as you listen to the coverage of the NFL draft, free agency, various podcasts, and YouTube channels that you're going to see over the course of the next few months. What does it mean that nickel is the new base defense? And do the distinctions between a 4-3 and a 3-4 scheme no longer matter? Let's get it up. All right. If you've been watching the Athletic Football Show or anything from PFF over the course of the last 5 to 10 years, you are not new to this phrase or this concept. But for those of you that do get all your football knowledge from me for some reason, I'm going to do a quick rundown of the two schemes functionally, as most teams run them, what the functional difference is schematically, and in terms of the personnel used in the front seven, and whether the fact that most teams are now in nickel the vast majority of the time as their base defense actually makes their so-called base defense irrelevant. Spoiler alert. It does not. When naming a defensive front, the first number is the number of down linemen, and the second is the number of linebackers. So a 3-4 defense has 3 down linemen and 4 linebackers. 3-4, 34. Of course, 2 of those linebackers play on or very close to the line of scrimmage, outside the tackles, but their hands are not on the ground, so they're not considered linemen, according to whoever came up with the arbitrary distinction back in the 70s. Basically, along this line of scrimmage on the outside, you'll have 2 edges in the 235 to 270 pound range as far as weight goes. They're typically athletic freaks for whatever their weight is in that range, and they rush the passer, hold the edge, and drop into coverage. Inside those 2, you'll have 2 more defensive linemen in the kind of 285 to 305 range, depending on the team, the player, the exact specifics of the scheme that they run. These guys can be pass rushers like J.J. Watt was, or they can be there more to push the pocket and stop the run, kind of like Steelers tend to use the guys in this spot. And then there's that giant man in the middle, the nose tackle, and how fat he is varies, again, depending on the specific team, but if there is a 350-pound guy on the field, that's this guy. For most teams, this toilet clogger is the guy who comes out when they go into their nickel defense the vast majority of the time, or at least that's how it works in Madden, and we all know that is the arbiter of all things football. A 4-3 defense has 4 down linemen and 3 off-ball linebackers. Along the line, the edges are usually in the 260 to 280 range. Again, there are outliers, but I'm just stereotyping here. Inside those 2, there will be kind of a littler guy and a bigger guy. The littler guy is usually referred to as a 3 technique. That's at like 290 to 305-ish in most cases. He's the explosive guy on the inside. These are the defensive line combine phenoms. And beside him is, again, a nose tackle. But in this case, we're usually looking more around 325, not 350. Because he still has to be able to move a little bit more. So that's your alignment difference between the 2 formations, 34, 43. There are other base defenses, but those are the big 2, and the rest are usually just variations on the themes presented by those 2, or they're named after what the secondary is doing, not the front. And that's a different video for later. These are like your Tampa 2s. That's a 3-4 defense in a cover 2 that does a couple specific things in coverage different from the norm. Your wide 9s, that's a 4-3 where the edges are way to the outside and the tackles. Your old school Steelers zone blitz was just a 4-3 defense where instead of being in man coverage when you blitzed, you were in zone coverage. And at the time that was revolutionary and amazing. Most of those have about a 5-year shelf life. and then if anyone is still running them, it is a drastically altered version that isn't the same as the original. But the actual difference between the concepts, the 4-3 and 3-4, is in the way that they stop the run and the way that they rush the passer. In the 3-4, the linemen fire directly into the chest plate of the offensive lineman in front of them, and they have the responsibility to play the gap on either side of that lineman wherever the ball goes. The edges fire off the edge, or they drop into coverage, and the linebackers cover whichever gaps the linemen don't handle in front of them. If the offense passes the ball, the linemen have a two-way go to go after the quarterback, or they're expected to push the offensive lineman into the quarterback's lap. That's the two ways that you can run that defense. And when I say there are two types of defenses thematically, and I say this all the time, so get used to it. You'll probably hear it a lot in the offseason. There is one defense that builds a wall and one defense that punches through the offense's wall. This is the wall-building defense. The 4-3, on the other hand, is typically the one that punches through the wall. The edges go outside the offensive tackles. The 3 technique rushes the A gap or the B gap to his side, and the nose or 1 technique just takes the A gap on the other side. They're not firing into the chest of the offensive lineman in front of them, but at most, kind of the shoulder pad to the side of the gap that they're going through. Players that aren't very good try to bypass the guy entirely, but like particularly on the interior, that doesn't really work. and teams will just see what you're doing. So it's usually you're trying to go through kind of like right about here. Whereas with that 3-4, you're firing like directly right into this spot and trying to push, and then wherever the ball goes, shed. Whereas with the 4-3, it is right here and go over, go under, whatever it is you're doing to do your move to get kind of through that side of the offensive lineman. So whether there are 3 linebackers or 4 or 2, the types of players a team is likely to draft comes from whether the basis of their defense is 4-3 or 3-4 in terms of that run defense. Like the gap shooting 3 tech who weighs 280 pounds, is 6'1", has short arms, just is not going to be drafted by a team that runs a 2-gap style of defense firing directly into the chest, because that guy just gets eaten in that defense. Because his first action on every snap gets him to a spot he physically can't get out of. An example from Lions' recent past. People were screaming from the high heavens that the Matt Patricia Lions should draft Ed Oliver, and that was just dumb. Like, he's the perfect guy for your 4-3 technique role. At least he kind of has eventually figured out how to do that. But his lack of power and his inability to hold the point of attack inside in the run game specifically made him a guy with no spot in Patricia's 3-4 base run scheme, which means that they would have been drafting in the top 10 a 3rd down and 2-minute drill only player for that defense. He just never would have gotten on the field. And this is how you're going to spot kind of lazy mock drafts. Team X that runs a 4-3 needs a pass rusher, so they'll take the 230-pound guy to play as their 4-3 base defense edge in round 1. The guy doing that doesn't know more than you about the team he's talking about. Most of us don't, frankly. Like, I know more about the Lions than most people. I don't know more about, say, the Browns and the specifics of their organization than most people. It's one of the reasons I don't do a lot of 32-team draft content. I'm not anywhere near as familiar with those other teams as I am with the Lions. So you probably shouldn't care who I think the Bills are going to take in the draft. Like, I'm probably going to do some mocks at some point just as an exercise because it's kind of fun. But that's not my gig. So you'll get imperfect picks at best from me. I do at least one like in the week before the draft. It's just a fun thing. I'll probably never talk about it again after the draft. I don't expect to be right. I don't pretend to be better connected than I am around the league. I'm just reading the bones that I roll and kind of telling you what they say. But as with all magic and folklore-based analysis, I'm going to be wrong more than I'm right about other teams' draft strategies. Like, hell, I get one or two guys every second or third season for the Lions, and I spend more time on this than a person should, just thinking about that kind of stuff. But back to why 3-4 and 4-3 matter for draft coverage still. Like, if your team runs a 4-3 style defense, they're likely to take explosive linemen over powerful linemen. They're likely to take faster and lighter off-ball linebackers because those guys are less likely to be getting blocked by an offensive lineman in that scheme. And these are generalities. There are exceptions, but like a 4-3 defense tends to stress athleticism down the middle more than power. If your team runs a 3-4, the center is defined by power. Two-gap run defense is about owning the man in front of you physically. The linebackers have offensive linemen taking free runs at them by design. Bigger interior guys, bigger linebackers, but then much smaller edges are acceptable. And not all nickel formations end up looking the same. Like the Madden nickel formation, which is what most people think of when they think nickel, is 4 down linemen, 2 linebackers, a slot corner, 2 outside corners, and a safety. It's the 4-3 defense minus 1 linebacker. It sacrifices run defense by having 1 less guy defending the run and 1 more off covering a slot receiver or something like that. That's how 4-3 teams do tend to run their nickel packages, but you'll also hear the term big nickel occasionally. That refers to when a team's playing a third safety rather than a slot corner, and that's a lot closer to what the Lions do. Rather than the 5'10", 180-pound traditional slot corner, this is a slot corner who also brings it in the run game. But that's also not the only way to run nickel, and that archetype has gone kind of by the wayside as nickel defense has become more prevalent because it is incredibly weak against the run. The 4-2 is definitely not a good base nickel defense. In that regard, at least. You'll see a lot of 3-4 teams do is they'll take those two 300-pound, they call them defensive ends, and they'll kind of pinch them in tighter. Usually they play kind of closer to the tackle, but they'll just take them and put them directly over top of basically the guard, and then they'll pinch in also with their edges, and then only have 1 off-ball linebacker. So it's basically like a 5-1 defense as opposed to that 4-2. It's also referred to as a bear front, but that's just really any alignment where there are 3 defensive tackles, where there's their head up on both guards and a center. On early downs, they'll bring a safety up into that missing linebacker spot if they need the extra run support. That's the thing. If you have the guys to stop the run out of this formation, you have a hat on a hat in terms of your lineman and their lineman, and then you have a linebacker coming in to make the tackle. You have safeties behind him. But if you need to bring a guy up, you bring a guy up, and it sacrifices. Obviously, there's 1 less guy at the back end, so that gives the opportunity for big plays in the passing offense, which is why you don't typically want to do that. But that's kind of how they deal with stopping the run out of nickel. You saw Ifeatu Melifonwu do this a fair amount during the season. He was kind of in that safety / linebacker spot. And they didn't do it all the time, but they did do it at times. You don't see a bunch of 4-3 teams whipping out bear fronts randomly because it suddenly asks their players to do very different things. Another variation the Lions did on this was kind of slide the nose and one of the defensive tackles into the gap outside of that. And then rather than an edge, they would put Jack Campbell or Derek Barnes on the outside. And they would usually drop into coverage, but sometimes rush. So even though every team runs nickel, there are different kinds of nickel defenses, and they utilize different player archetypes, generally based on the base defense that the team's defensive philosophy actually comes from. So, everything is more fluid than it used to be, but a team that runs a base 4-3 isn't going to draft a 350-pound nose tackle very often. They're not going to take that two-down thumper linebacker because that's a role that just doesn't exist in that defense anymore. And a 3-4 team is probably not taking Ed Oliver or Kalijah because those guys don't really have the ability to play two-gap run defense particularly well. Because the real secret to running nickel as your base defense is that you have to be able to stop the run with 6 people instead of 7. You need to be running a 6-man box as opposed to a 7-man box and still successfully stopping the run. That's why the Lions place value on run defense so highly from their defensive linemen, because if 6 guys can get the job done that used to require 7, the defense has an extra guy in coverage. And now, for the Lions, that guy is Brian Branch. So you definitely want him on the field as much as possible, because from that position, he takes advantage of what those linemen are doing and creates tackles for loss and is just a spectacular coverage player. So to conclude the topic, while teams do not run a 4-3 or a 3-4 as their actual base defense the majority of the time, the designation still tells you what kind of players they're likely to draft or sign in free agency, particularly in the linebacker core and along the defensive line. Have a great day.